Recycling doesn't necessarily mean that it goes back into the same product. Fluff is an example where the use of that type of fluff is quite specific to hygiene products, so it makes sense that it goes back into a hygiene product. Super absorbent also is mainly used in hygiene products, but I really am quite skeptical in the performance of a super absorbent after recycling. So maybe it goes into lower specification absorbent product. Maybe not hygiene, maybe like flood management, things like this. So that would definitely be downcycling. But again, it's probably because the performance is downgraded.
Welcome back to our series on sustainability. If you've made it this far with us, you've heard us cover several different aspects of sustainability and disposable hygiene over the previous 3 episodes. We've discussed consumer expectations and product transparency, and shared different ideas around improving production practices and reducing the weight of your hygiene products, before sharing some insights on circularity and circular economy in disposable hygiene. If you haven't listened to at least the previous episode on sustainability, which would be part 3, I would encourage you to do so, as it leads directly into the last part of our conversation on circularity today. Welcome to Attached to Hygiene, the podcast that enables you to grow your knowledge and influence in the disposable hygiene industry. I'm Jack Hughes, Global Digital Marketing Manager for Bostic's Disposable Hygiene Business Unit. On today's episode, we'll wrap up our discussion with Christophe Morel on circularity by covering end-of-life solutions for the hygiene industry and which direction or directions we should move in to help meet our sustainability goals and the goals of the end users of the hygiene products. We certainly don't claim to have all the answers, but through our own research, as well as talking and working with other suppliers and producers of hygiene articles, we feel we have some good insights on a direction that our industry can move in that will help our planet and the industry overall. With that, we'll continue with the rest of our interview with Christophe Morel. So going back to those 3 points around circularity, we covered resource management there. Our last episode with Luke and Safe was pretty dedicated to manufacturing processes, so I don't think we need to dive too far into that. And you touched on that at the beginning of this episode, some of the things that producers are doing and other players in the industry are doing to improve their manufacturing processes. So then the last thing, and probably the most important part, is the end, and the most visible to consumers, the end users, would be the end of life. So obviously this is, as I said, a very important one. So what are industry players doing to improve the end of life of hygiene products?
You're right in saying that it's going to be the most visible to the end consumer, because at some point or another they'll have to kind of participate in making that end of life more sustainable. At the moment they just put the diapers in the bin and those go into just the municipal waste. But consumers already start having bins for paper, for plastics, for glass, etc. So at some point there will be something to be done for disposable hygiene article. And it can go from nothing really difficult, maybe just isolate the diapers and waiting for someone to pick them up, or send them back by mail, or going to a specific bin. Or at some point you could think of maybe a specific design where the consumer already has to tear apart something. Maybe on a diaper tear apart the elastic ears, tear apart or separate the core, the absorbent core from the backsheet material. So it goes from very simple to a bit more complicated for the consumer, and that's interesting because all of what I've been saying, this is kind of happening already as pilot situations. So there are experiments in Europe or even also in the US on the concept of sending back your used diapers in a box. Or there are experiments that are conducted by P&G where there are smart bins somewhere in the city, and you can bring your bag of used diapers. You can register, and so that's happening. And there are also experiments where the diapers are collected from a daycare center, for example, to be either composted or recycled. So that will be the first part. How do you manage the collection and how do you educate the consumer? And so I think diaper producers are trying to do this at the moment and trying to understand what could work from a consumer perspective, how they could, as a reputable brand, how they could influence the consumer and educate the consumer. But in the end, it's going to have to be municipalities or maybe they will have to have regulations to kind of force the system into changing, because at the moment it's really experimenting what could be the business model, what could be the technical model to do it, and the companies are doing this pretty much on their own. We were at a conference where the Flemish Waste Agency, so the Flanders region of Belgium, so their waste agency is really working on creating the legal framework to actually make diaper recycling the only option for the end of life of baby diapers. So they're kind of putting the legal framework before the technical options are there, but it would they would have to define how you can incentivize consumers to do it, or maybe punish them for not doing it, and how you put the collection system in place. So I think it's going to have to go both ways. How do you define the technical aspects and how you implement it, and how you get the governments, local governments, municipalities to help in this.
So in your opinion, just to pivot from that briefly, that's something, again, that Nick Carter talked about in the episode, particularly in the United States, some states, some municipalities banning single-use hygiene products or putting limitations on them before there's really a solution, or an alternative in place to really do that. And you mentioned, in some places we have producers creating the technical avenues to be able to do that. In other places, we have municipalities or cities or regions really pushing for it. In my opinion, it's probably better to have the technical solution first, but there also has to be some sort of pressure on the producers to push for that, to get to that point. Because if you have the laws in place first or the regulations in place first without a solution, then you're putting all the people living there in a tough situation or an impossible situation. But in some cases, maybe if you just left it to the producers, it might not happen on a expedited timeline. So I guess in your opinion, what's the balance there?
Again, referring to the packaging industry, I think they're all part of consortiums to try to find a solution. I mean, and this is what needs to happen. And there was a recent initiative by EDANA, the European Nonwovens Association, to actually create that type of consortium around the concept of creating a resource from the waste of used disposable diapers. And so, again, there needs to be a technical way to do it. There needs to be a business model to do it, but then there is a need to have a legal incentive and a legal framework to do it. And so everything needs to happen together. So I guess before implementing laws without a technical model, or before trying a technical model for ages, then just sit down together.
Yeah, maybe a simple answer, but not a simple. Yeah, simple in concept, not so simple to execute.
Right.
All right. So you mentioned some of the things going on for end-of-life solutions. You talked about recycling. You talked about more of maybe a modular approach where consumers are kind of deconstructing the diapers. So then at that point, Bostik is an adhesive supplier. So then what role does the adhesive play in supporting all those end-of-life possibilities?
So to your question, Jack, I'll be even broader than you. I say, where can the adhesive contribute into that circular model for a disposable hygiene product? So if we look back at the sequence of this circular model, so the first aspect is the resource part. So reduce the dependency on fossil resources. So from that point of view, the adhesive can contribute by also relying less on fossil resources. So we can develop adhesives that are based on renewable resources, bio-based materials. And so this is the object of the Nupla Viva launch that we discussed about, and where we are offering to the market adhesives that are bio-based or renewable. So that's the first part. The second part is the design aspect. So how can the adhesive contribute to designing a more sustainable finished article? So we said that a more sustainable finished article would be low in weight. So we can reduce the amount of adhesive used in an article. We can help the producers use lower basis weight substrates and therefore reduce the overall weight of the diaper. Our core adhesive can help the diaper manufacturer reduce the amount of fluff used in the core and therefore reduce the thickness of the article, reduce the weight of the article. So that's another aspect. Then in the design phase, if the objective of the manufacturer is to use more bio-based substrates, such as again PLA or natural fibers or bio-PE, etc. So then the adhesive needs to enable this. So make sure that the adhesive bonds perfectly to these type of substrates, which are quite different sometimes chemically from the good old polypropylene and polyethylene. So we need to make sure that the adhesives can adapt to these materials. So that's the third aspect. And the last aspect on the design phase is, again, if I go back to a design that not only meets the function of a diaper, which is avoid leakage, etc., but also is set up in order to facilitate the end of life or facilitate recycling, for example. So, what about an adhesive that could help you design a product that is more easily recyclable? An adhesive that would help you at some point, instead of having a full article in the end, an adhesive that could help you dismantle the article more easily so that you can get rid of, maybe compost a part of the article and then throw away another part or recycle one part. And so I think the adhesive is a great resource to enable new designs. And this is where I think we should be more involved and more discussing with customers on. And then again, the last part of it is, how does the adhesive contribute to the end of life? And again, so I was making some suggestions on redesigning the product to help the end of life. But at this point, with what we have, if you look at composting as an end of life, so the first thing that the adhesive would need to do is also being compostable in order to have the whole article compostable. And this is work that we are doing in order to enable this. The second aspect is recycling. So if we're looking at the existing processes of recycling, where the plastics and the fluff and SAP and the bodily fluids are somewhat separated in order to be treated in different waste streams. So I think if the adhesive could help facilitate that separation, that would be a benefit. If the adhesive could help, making the plastic fraction more valuable, that will also be a benefit. And these are interesting ideas that we're also looking at internally in order to share that later on with our customers. So those are very interesting aspects where I think the adhesive can have a very positive contribution.
And in your opinion, I think I know others in the industry share this opinion, but recyclability is the most viable path forward for a beneficial end of life for hygiene products at this point in time, correct?
I think that's my view indeed. I mean, again, if we think carbon, right, the best way to keep the carbon that is, that we put in all these films and all these products that compose the diaper, if we look at keeping that carbon on Earth, then recycling is the only way. Even composting will lose a lot of that carbon as CO2 or even worse, methane in the atmosphere. So, if you look at keeping the carbon in order to be reused in new organic materials, then yeah, recycling is. So I don't know if it's the most viable from a technical standpoint, from a financial standpoint, but from a resource conservation standpoint, it is.
Okay. So I've always been skeptical of that, but I live in the U.S. Our recycling system is not as robust, isn't the right term, but maybe efficient as some places in Europe. And even our ability here in the U.S. to recycle common products, as you mentioned, paper and cardboard, but glass and metal, and especially plastic, it's not great. It's efficient in some areas, it's not so efficient in other areas. And that makes me kind of skeptical of, particularly in the U.S., our ability to recycle hygiene products, which is just a whole different beast, if you will. And so my thought was always around compostability. But I know you shared this with me a little bit, and you just alluded to it, that composting maybe isn't the best option out there. You mentioned the release of CO2 and methane, but
yeah, and composting is not just just vanishing, right? So I don't know if you live in a house or if you have a garden, but composting is not going to be just throwing this away at the back of your garden and let it compost like this. And for most of people living in an urban environment, that's even not possible. And so composting also means an industrial process that requires facilities, that requires collection. So, recycling and composting will still start from sorting and collecting the waste. So no matter how you look at it, this is going to be the key first step. And so, again, I don't know what to do with how to work with consumers. And as you said, if you are not even able to recycle PET bottles, which are I would say the most easily recyclable plastic, I think, so far. So how are you going to do with diapers, which or fem care products even more, which have the kind of taboo around what's in there, and you don't want to be handling these and putting this into a plastic, and what about wait for a week for a collection to come and pick it up? So yeah, it's a long way from having a viable option out there, but we have to start somewhere, and at least making sure that some of these options are technically viable and make sense from an environmental standpoint.
Yeah.
And going back to recycling and collection, if the collection involves so much energy or so much gas to drive hundreds of miles to collect and bring the diapers to a recycling facility, then where is the benefit to the environment?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's always my sticking point on recycling. I think it's and even compost collection, which is offered in my municipality, and garbage pickup. If my bins aren't full, I don't put them out, because it's just extra miles, and extra energy being used to pick them up and dump a half-empty bin into a truck and drive away. So that's a very good point. So yeah, on top of the CO2 and methane emissions, as well as you mentioned, compostability faces the same challenges as recycling, and educating consumers, having to pick it up, and all of the work and energy and processes that go into actually composting, not just natural materials, but AHPs as well. There are other downsides to that as well, correct?
Yeah, I think one of the downsides is the fact that used absorbent hygiene products contain bodily fluids, And so, as much as all the recycling processes that we've looked at that are being tested, they include a sterilization step in order to kill all the pathogens that may be in the bodily fluids. Composting, industrial composting, only happens at 60 degrees maximum, and what happens with the pathogens there is the quality of the compost enough to be used in any type of crop environment. And I think that even in some countries, it's not even legal to use compost that was in contact with bodily fluids. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, I think we've seen this in a conference, is the fact that most of what is being composted usually is food waste and tree trimmings or whatever, lawn trimmings.
Yard waste.
Yeah, yard waste. Yeah, good. Thank you. And so these compost pretty well. I mean, except for some parts of the wood, the lignin, everything. But these food waste and everything, they compost pretty well. And the concern might be that when you come up with synthetic materials that are designed to be compostable, but still, do they compost as fast as the food waste and yard waste? Maybe not. And actually, it's been shown that they don't. And so you may kind of hurt the balance in having some materials that compost very quickly, some don't. And so in the end, you may end up with problems in the composting facility. So
so, and then they.
I mean, it just means that there is no easy solution. That's for sure. There is no easy solution. Again, recycling is also a very complicated process. And then what do you do with the recycled materials? If you are really able to separate everything cleanly so that you have good fluff and good SAP on one side, and is the SAP, after being recycled like this, is it still performing to a standard that is valid for hygiene products? Can you actually put fluff back into hygiene products? It's an interesting question, and apparently Unicharm in Japan has the right process to put fluff back into diapers. They announced that they would, so that's great. That's really a good way of recycling.
Yeah.
But then your plastic fraction, as I said, is composed of all sorts of plastic materials, and it's relatively low quality.
Yeah.
And I was at a conference where the people from the Nova Institute were talking about that carbon idea. So where are we going to get our carbon from in the future? So currently we're getting most of it from fossil resources. But in the future, if you want to be true to reducing carbon emissions or solving the climate change issues, we'll have to reduce to a minimum to even zero our dependency on fossil resources. So we'll have to get our carbon from either plants or CO2. There is chemistry to transform CO2 back into monomers that can then help us do the petrochemistry that we're used to. And then, so plant-based CO2 and recycled materials, recycled plastics. So the dependency on recycled plastics and recycled carbon will be huge in the future. And so there will be a huge expectation on the quality of recycled plastics in the future. So
yeah, and I want to come back to that, but you mentioned there's still a lot of progress to be made in the aspect of, or in the area of recycling, consumer education, the processes in general, getting municipalities on board, what materials are coming out of that, which I'll ask about in a minute. But right now, obviously, you mentioned a few examples in the market of recycling going on. We do see some examples in the market. You mentioned P&G. You also mentioned Unicharm. So we know that there are some options out there, but they're not widely available, and it's still in early development phases. So how far away do you think we are from seeing widely available recyclable products on the market?
I think the critical aspect would be that we don't need to see recyclable products. We need to see a process that can recycle any product. That's the main issue. At least, let's say, you cannot just have a brand that just makes a specific product that they only can recycle. So I think it's still pretty far off. I think that there will be a good business model, technical model to actually recycle diapers.
Okay.
I don't know how to.
You're not going to put a number to it.
I not other than the alternate answer to that is I have no clue. But
so then you mentioned the actual materials involved and being able to have high quality plastics coming out of those recycling processes. So do you think the target is to have AHPs be recycled into AHPs, or do you think it's better or more likely that we're having them recycled into other things or downcycled or things like that?
I mean, recycling doesn't necessarily mean that it goes back into the same product. Fluff is an example where the use of that type of fluff is quite specific to hygiene products, so it makes sense that it goes back into a hygiene product. Super absorbent also is mainly used in hygiene products, but I really am quite skeptical in the performance of a super absorbent after recycling. So maybe it goes into lower, not quality, but lower specification absorbent product. Maybe not hygiene, maybe like flood management products, things like this. So that would definitely be downcycling. But again, it's probably because the performance is downgraded. And as for plastics, I think there is a demand for recycled plastic. So if the plastic is good quality, then there is no shortage of potential applications. Now, I mean, the kind of great solution to all of these in terms of recycling for both, mainly for plastic, I would say, is chemical recycling, where the plastics are actually pyrolyzed at very high temperature and transformed back into either syngas or an oil, and both can be fed back into the petrochemistry stream. And you create brand new chemicals out of it, so that whether the quality of the originating material was good or bad, it's kind of burned back into the monomers, so it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty energy intensive. The capacity to do this is even lower than mechanical recycling. So again, it's a long shot, but it's
potential option.
Yeah.
So then, as I mentioned, and you mentioned as well, we're both a little skeptical, and we think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to educate consumers, even to get to the point of having, regardless of if there's a recyclable product out there, but actually getting them to recycle it properly, and then having the third-party players in place, whether it be recycling companies, whether it be municipalities, to collect and get those back to whoever's processing them. But I guess, in my opinion, the role of the producer doesn't stop at producing the product. So in your opinion, what role do producers play in this recycling process as a solution?
Well, as I said, I mean, they're developing the technical option, but they're also trying to understand the business model, and they're trying to evaluate different collection systems and see how they can influence, using the power of the brand, how they can influence the consumers. That's, again, experimenting. But in the end, someone will have to select and implement. And I don't think they can do it on their own. There has to be some sort of coalition, I would say.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before, but one entity isn't going to solve this issue. It needs to be collaboration across producers, suppliers, municipalities, and consumers have a role to play as well. All right. Well, with that we covered a whole lot there. I really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us and sharing what's going on in the industry and also sharing your opinions on some of the solutions being offered or solutions that are being developed. So thank you again, Christophe, for joining us. It's great having you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you haven't done so, I highly encourage all of you to sign up for our Attached to Hygiene newsletter. Every 2 weeks, we'll notify you of the release of our latest episode. And starting this week, we'll begin sharing some of our new content around sustainability, starting with our brand new updated sustainability glossary, which shares all sorts of terms relevant to sustainability and disposable hygiene and will help you discuss this topic and know what you're talking about. In the coming weeks, we'll also be sharing our 2 new sustainability white papers. We'll continue sharing exclusive content in the newsletter throughout the rest of the year. All of this content will be shared with our podcast listeners and subscribers before it is shared on our website or in our other email campaigns. So if you want to stay up to date on everything we know about industry topics like sustainability, absorbent core, feminine hygiene, and others, check out the link in the show notes to sign up for the Attached to Hygiene newsletter. Attached to Hygiene is brought to you by Bostic and is hosted by me, Jack Hughes. It is produced and edited by me with the help of Paul Andrews, Michelle Tonkovitz, Emery Chernus, and Nikki Ackerman at Green Onion Creative. Our theme music is by Jonathan Boyle. We'd like to extend a special thank you to our guest today, Christophe Morel. You can find Christophe on LinkedIn. You can feel free to address any emails to him directly at hygiene@bostic.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.